because I understand how people love to hear people talk about politics, or if you're my wife, politics or technology, or both. I was online Googling for just checking things out last night after 3D to see if there was anything else I wanted to add. Putting in certain Google search terms, and I was a little disturbed to find out that, do you realize the trend on Google is people really shouldn't talk about business and politics? Too bad. Okay. So, actually, what I got to thank Justin for inviting me to speak here on this. I was going to do this for a Mobile Twin Cities event because, and in actuality, you're going to find out more about mobile than you will about politics. But the campaign trail is a very interesting case study, if you will, on how mobile technology can be used in many different ways. And just a little bit of information about my campaign, so we can set some scope here. I did run for the Minnesota State Senate in 2010 in Maplewood, Oakdale, and North St. Paul. The population of that district is 77,000 people, 53,000 potential voters, 28,000 people actually voted, and I got 2,000 of those votes. The percentage I like is the 7.2% as opposed to taking that map any higher up that scale. But what's important about these numbers is any business has a customer base it needs to get its message to and it needs to attract. All of those numbers play some important part, but I'm going to focus on the very last one, the 29,000 doors that I tried to knock on and the 29,000 households I tried to get to. Because that's where the mobility really is the focus, where that really comes into play. But you'll find out that's not the only place. So one of the things that happens whenever I talk to anyone about being the fact that actually in real life, by the way, those of you who don't know me, I am a geek. I do this for fun. I had an interview with the Capitol Report, and the interviewer was asking me about my campaign and about my business, and I do wireless data consulting. And he said, okay, well, what are your hobbies? And I go, well, politics and toys, gadgets. He's like, no, that's what you do regular. I said, if I was an optometrist, I'd still have 5 phones and still go door knocking every summer. But when I talk to people about being in wireless and politics, everyone always says, oh yeah, just like Obama used to win his election. Well, there's a little bit of a difference if you haven't read ahead on the slide. He ran for president. He was a major party candidate, and he had a little bit bigger budget than I did. So a lot of what people talk about in wireless and the successful wireless campaign that President Obama ran really relied on that third line, the budget, but it also relied on his army of technical volunteers. And that's important because what I'm going to tell you about is President Obama's use of wireless was pretty different than mine. His use of wireless was actually aimed at that army of volunteers, not at voters, not at the end subjects. I, on the other hand, the only technical volunteer I had was the guest at today's presentation. So those are some of the differences. Now, comparing President Obama's campaign to mine would be sort of like comparing Best Buy to my company. And it's those differences that I want to focus on when we talk about how a small endeavor, whether it's a small political campaign or a small business, can use mobility to their advantage. So not only are there comparisons in the size, but there's also comparisons in how a political campaign can be like a business. You know, a business has to do market research. In my real world feet on the streets, that means that in doing my homework for the campaign, I attended roughly 24, 48, probably about 60 to 70 city council meetings over 2 years in 3 different cities. attended pretty much every open meeting I could attend to learn about the issues that face the voters in my district. Where a business wants to get to know the customer, I would take people I met, whether it was at those meetings, city council meetings, or letters to the editor, and I would actually keep notes on those people in a database that I accessed with my iPad. Now, here's where we'll start to talk about mobility. I kept those notes while I was sitting in that city council meeting. So if I'm sitting there and Colin Lee comes up and talks about trash haulers, I would keep notes on my iPad at the time, because it was easier for me to do it there while he's speaking than to wait for the city to upload the minutes, make sure their minutes matched with what my thoughts were of Colin's comments. So mobility started sitting in the city council meetings, getting to know what voters felt about what issues. Another thing business needs to do is media outreach. And I'll tell you, for all this talk people have about using Twitter in political campaigns, this is the one most successful application of Twitter in a small political campaign. I didn't use Twitter to reach the voter. I used Twitter to outreach to media outlets who maybe wouldn't normally cover me, but because they heard what I was saying, they heard the issues, it enticed them a bit. And then lastly, pitching your product. In my case, pitching my product above and beyond attending community festivals and stuff like that. Basically, in a campaign my size, I pitched my product one door at a time. And every door, for me, at least in my view, needed to be unique. Not just because of who answered the door, but how could I talk to that individual differently than their neighbor and the neighbor after that. So delivering a personalized message is also important. So let's talk first about market research. When I go to a city council meeting, I will always have my iPad, maybe a Zoom in the future, but for the campaign it was an iPad. And I could access the city council's agenda. I could access their supporting documents right from my device in the city council chambers. So if you've ever watched a city council meeting, I'm sorry, but if you actually enjoyed it or do it with purpose, you'll know they have a binder probably about this thick every meeting with diagrams of construction projects and all of that. Joe Public walks in, you get one sheet of paper that says we're going to talk about this, 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 and this. And then they're up there saying, well, yeah, but if you look at page 325, so I would actually access the website and get those documents. I would download them onto my iPad, and I would use a product like Documents to Go, which is available on, whether it was available even on my BlackBerry, on an Android, on an Apple product, any of those. And I could read those documents right there from my seat. Again, mobile application. I would use the same thing accessing city code if they referred to it, or state statutes. Another tool that was very cool though, cities often talk about projects, whether it's zoning or construction and that. Google Maps became really helpful because I found out in talking to public works staff that I usually had a better view of the project than they did, because they'd come, the public works people would come with they're still going to meetings with these big rolls of maps and charts, and city council is looking at, you know, a document that might look this big in the public works room, and then it's shrunk down to 8.5 by 11 for their package. Of course, with Google Maps on whatever device it was, I can expand it, zoom in, all of that. I prefer the tablet for all of that, just easier to read, but every one of those things in my market research I could do any mobile device, predominantly with Google Maps, Documents to Go, or websites being the browser. So all the stuff in my market research, really only one paid app that I needed to use, and that was Documents to Go. And to be honest, it's probably the first app I would buy with any device, being able to read Word, PowerPoint, Excel, PDF documents. Another component of a successful business or a successful campaign is getting to know your customer. And in this case, again, whether it was a city council meeting or Oakdale Summerfest or Maplewood Days or Taste of Maplewood, I talked to citizens out on, at these meetings. And I would use my iPad at a city council meeting or a meeting where it wasn't real obtrusive to have, if I'm at a city council meeting sitting in a chair, this is not all that obtrusive. If I'm at Oakdale Summerfest and I go up to Bill and I'm standing in front of Bill with this in between us, not so comfortable. So in those cases, I would have my iPhone or I'd have another smartphone with me. But I could walk away from Bill at Oakdale Summerfest, go back to my booth, and I'd take notes on what Bill and I talked about. And I would plug those into a database that I built using an application called HandyBase. HandyBase is available on BlackBerry, iOS, and Android. Those three I know for sure. I've used it on all three. And I just took the Minnesota voters list, brought that in as raw data, and then I would search through that list anytime I met a citizen to update my notes on that. HandyBase with 48,000 names, which was the size of the database from the Secretary of State's office I had, sort of choked on BlackBerry. Got to confess that. Works pretty well on the iPad. I had to break the database into a couple of chunks to make it more manageable. But the nice thing is for the majority of my campaign, it was either the iPad or an iPhone. And I was able to keep notes on all of these people, which will come into play in a little bit. Maybe I didn't meet them in person. Maybe I was reading the local newspaper or even the Pioneer Press, to refer back to Julio, and someone from my district wrote an email in regarding state spending or tax policy or something like that. Immediately I would put that into the database as well. And then as public comments and stuff, I would hand enter that later. So here I am getting to know my customer, again, using mobile technology. The component on media outreach, actually, when I wrote this, you're going to see there's a slide later where I say I only use 2 paid apps. Well, I've already mentioned them. It was Documents to Go and HandyBase. I guess I never think about the Twitter, Facebook, and Livecast apps. Those are all free, but those don't come pre-installed necessarily. So there were more than 2 apps, but there were still only 2 paid apps I've used through the entire campaign. Media outreach for me was the same as a large campaign and trying to get to the media. But again, I told you in one of the earlier slides that a large campaign like Obama's is also reaching out to its volunteers. For my campaign and the size of my volunteer staff, I used chicken McNuggets. My main volunteer, the kid who walked every block with me, knocked on every door with me, if I took him to McDonald's for a little bit of a break in the middle, it was great. If anyone has any question that today's youth don't understand or don't appreciate political campaigns, the greatest compliment I got from anyone during my entire campaign is after the first day of door knocking, I drove TJ back to his parents' house. He walked in, and his parents, of course, are a little trepidatious about how his first day door knocking with a politician went. And they said, "So how'd it go?" And his quote was, "This is better than video games." I'm keeping my eyes on that kid, because anyone who's got whatever screw that is loose, I appreciate that. But to talk back to the media outreach, all kinds of social media tools you use, and you want to use them in conjunction with each other. You don't want the media or potential voters who are tech savvy to think you use one over the other. I'm going to tell you a great story about Twitter, though, and not going to take these in order. I'm going to take the social media and the handshakes in together. With Twitter, so I set up Twitter accounts. I very intentionally followed all of the political reporters, all of the media outlets, all of the local media, certain politicians. And it happened to be state fair time. And I worked at the state fair at the Independence Party booth one day. And I'm walking in, and I have to confess, I don't text and drive, but I can navigate the state fair crowds pretty well doing this. And I was walking to the Independence Party booth, pretty much heads down looking at my phone, and all of a sudden, as I'm walking, boop, Bob Collins from Minnesota Public Radio is now following you on Twitter. Oh, cool. Open up my Twitter app, and the very next tweet from Bob Collins is, I'm working at the Minnesota Public Radio booth today at the state fair. For anyone who's on either side of the digital divide now, here's a piece of advice for you. If you think you can cover the whole world with Twitter alone, not so much. If you're older school like me and you think you can conquer everything with just a handshake, let me tell you, Twitter paid huge dividends for me that day, because as I'm doing this and I have those two events on Twitter, I go right by the Independence Party booth, and where'd I go? I went to the Minnesota Public Radio booth, immediately went up, introduced myself to Bob Collins, shook his hand, and he offered to do a story walking and knocking on doors with me from the fact I just went up and pressed the flesh with a member of the media. It's as much a technology story as it is how you use it. And I really encourage, when I give speeches at organizations that may have that 60-plus crowd, I don't get Twitter. Twitter's just a waste of time. I don't care where you went for lunch or any of that stuff. But if you use it properly and you use it mobilely, my bias here, if I had waited till I got home to check my Twitter feed and go, wow, it's 9 at night, Bob Collins is following me, this is really cool. And he was there all day, and so was I. So mobility in that regard was absolutely critical and helpful with Twitter. I also used Facebook. Facebook was actually, for me, more a communications tool for my volunteers, for other people in my party, to let them know, I used Facebook Places. Oh, Mark's at a city council meeting today. Mark's at the watershed district. Mark's doing this. So they could see that I was engaged in the community. Facebook also generated a pretty interesting story, and again, a mobile story, because I would use Facebook, if I'm using Places, I'm not checking in when I get back home, I'm checking in from where I'm at. Well, I had a number of people from my district who were following me, and all of a sudden, a few of them started to disappear. Well, one of my opponents had gone out and started to tell my Facebook followers that, you really shouldn't follow him, and blah, blah, blah. Well, going back to the more social skills in a political campaign, I got proactive, and the people who had disappeared, I saw the trend. I went to the next person on the list who I expected to have go away, who happened to be the mayor of Maplewood, and a vocal supporter of my opponent. And I just said, hey, by the way, you want to be aware, Chuck is probably going to call you up and say, hey, stop following Mark because it doesn't look good that you're my supporter and you're following the competition. And at a city council meeting, I'm on Facebook and I'm following the city council and talking to the mayor. He says, Mark, I support Chuck. At the same point, you are a friend. You've done a lot for this city. I'm not walking away from you. If Chuck even dares ask, tough, I'm sticking with you. And that was important because people who were following the situation saw that there were some people who, they knew Chuck was, or they knew that the mayor was supporting my opponent, but it meant something that he didn't abandon me at the same time. And so Facebook was helpful in communicating that message to the people in the party and supporters. The last one, and there's plenty of options here, but has anyone ever used Livecast? Anyone familiar with it? Livecast, I guess, is what I'll call really old school when it comes to live video. How many of you were here for Julio's presentation? He talked about Robert Stevenson's opportunities with Fireball and all of that. Actually, many years earlier, Livecast had signed a contract with the AP, and all AP producers, Associated Press, all of the Associated Press producers were given a Nokia handset with Livecast software on it. Now, to pull this into perspective, I don't remember the year, but if there's any World Series fans here, you can probably plug that date in for me. When the Yankees were in the World Series, okay, that doesn't narrow it down, does it? One of the years the Yankees was in the World Series, one of the pitchers for a California team decided to go for a little joyride in his airplane before the team went back to California. Unfortunately, it was rather cloudy at a very low altitude, and his plane got stopped rather abruptly by an apartment building. There was an AP producer who was walking on the street, heard the fire call, and realized he was, just as Robert Stevens was, a couple of blocks away from the incident. The very first footage of the plane wreck, if you recall it or if you ever pull it up, you'll recognize that the camera was this far away from a piece of the wing or other debris from the airplane. And if you've ever been around a scene like that, there's no way you get close enough beyond the yellow tape unless you beat the emergency crews there. That was actually filmed with a Nokia N95 running Livecast software, and that footage was actually broadcast live on New York TV stations, and then the video was archived and recorded and broadcast later on national outlets. So the concept of what Robert Stevens did is absolutely amazing, but it's not new. It's been around for, I want to say, at least 3, maybe 4 years. Well, how I used Livecast, and I've used it both in my campaign and I've used it in some U.S. Senate campaigns, and it works actually better in a U.S. Senate campaign, because you're trying to get media from around the state, is we would broadcast from Farm Fest in southwest Minnesota. Or if I had someone ask me a really good question that gee, that's a great thing I'd like other people to hear about, I would actually livecast, have someone hold the camera while I had a conversation with a voter, or while another candidate that I was working for was speaking around the state. And then Livecast will send an alert to Twitter. So let's just pretend Tom May is with the media here, and I start to film myself talking to a voter. Tom's going to get a tweet right away saying, Mark is broadcasting live from Farm Fest. Click on this link to see the video. So Livecast is real helpful in that regard, to give people more than just a text website interface into the campaign. Again, with all of those though, with all of the social media tools, they mean a heck of a lot more if you can have those relationships with Bob Collins and Mayor Will Rosbach and that face to face. So as much as I talk about technology throughout the year, I always want people to know putting a handshake with that technology makes a whole lot of difference. The last thing, last thing we'll talk about today is actually pitching your product. And for me, now it's time to put together the research I did on the issues, time to do the getting to know my customer from the meetings and the events I went to, and bring that all together and bring that to that person's door. And so what I did is, if most of the time I had my Chicken McNugget driven volunteer with me, and he would stand a couple feet behind me with my iPad, and as we walked door to door, he would go through that database that I've been maintaining for 2 years, and he would come up and say, okay, you're coming up to the Smith house, it's Bob and Mary, and he's in favor of PolarNet, which was an internet project North St. Paul was trying. So I'd go to the door. If a guy came to the door, I'd go, hi, are you Bob? I immediately knew, based on the data, whether I'm talking to Bob or Mary. Then we talk, and I could talk to him about an issue that was important to him, not just, hi, I'm a politician and I want you to vote for me, and I have no clue what you care about. So this gave me an opportunity to talk about issues that were important. There were some times that I'd go into a neighborhood and there was the St. Paul Regional Water Service in their backyard, and they got into the habit of driving big over-the-road trucks on a dirt road or along the fence line late at night. Neighbors didn't like that much, but I'd attended the meetings on it and I knew what was going on. And in those neighborhoods, I could talk about that issue. All of that data gathering I did during the campaign, I now had with me every door I knocked on. The other thing I did, though, is my data gathering didn't stop at the door, because once I talked to that person, I'd find out if I hadn't seen them at an event, if they hadn't written an editorial. Of course, I gathered what was important to them. I talked to them about what was important, and I would put that down on here. That can be used for following up with them on issues that are important. Whether I'm elected or not, if the city has an issue coming up that they expressed a keen interest in, I can re-engage them now because I have that data. The majority of the time, it was the iPad. If I was door knocking alone, again, this looks pretty odd that you have a candidate and is using technology and I don't know what he's recording on me. So I'd use my iPhone and I'd wait till I got to the end of the driveway and then I'd do it there. One of the things I wanted to talk about, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it is important with whatever application you use with mobile technology, make sure you understand the limits of the technology you're using. So one day, my volunteer and I were out knocking on doors, taking notes. It was a little warm out. I think the weather said it was about 114 degrees heat index. And all of a sudden, my volunteer goes, Mark? I'm like, yeah. The iPad died. What do you mean, died? Well, it flashed up this message saying, it's too hot, I'm shutting down. Well, the iPhone had been in the pocket out in the sun the whole time, so we retired this, put it in the backpack, did the rest of it with the iPhone. Now, this is where I have a little hint for developers, and this company has since fixed the product, but the database, since it crashed because the iPad crashed, at that time it didn't have an autosave function. So we lost a couple hours of door knocking data. Now, obviously I still got to talk to the citizens, we still engaged, but there's a number of records in here that say data lost to iPad crash. Actually, after the campaign ended, there was another update. I had nothing to do with it. But someone else must have, because after the campaign, they came up with an update that actually had an autosave schedule. So now, the next time I go door knocking, if the heat kills my iPad, I'll at least have some amount of data saved. But that's how I would use mobile to collect information, and it doesn't have to be a political campaign. It can be, you know, a public issues campaign. It could be for your Boy Scout troop. It could be for, you know, an issue that you're interested in, or a lot of those same things could be issues that your business deals with and how you engage customers. What's important, though, is that mobile technology can, and I would argue more importantly, should be an integral part of any venture, big or small, partisan or nonpartisan. The mobile tools existing today, as I said, of all the applications I use, the database is probably the trickiest or the most sophisticated of the applications I used. Everything else I used is really industry standard. It's free, except for the documents to go, and there's a whole series of options in that regard. So through the whole campaign, I only used 2 paid mobile apps, and predominantly it was the browser and document readers. Now, an absolutely unapologetic, blatant pitch. If your needs can't be met by free and apps that are available in the App Store, right on the other side of this wall, are a bunch of people who would love to help you out. And they're friends of mine from Mobile Twin Cities. And if it hasn't been thought of, they would love to work with you and help you figure that out. With that, that's the extent of my prepared comments. If you guys have questions, issues, I would love to answer them.
So one question I was thinking about was, I was literally thinking about you gathering this data, and then before you go knock on a door, you can look up, here's Joe Schmedlap, even though you said you needed the data to choose between Bob and Mary, and I thought, well, I have another way, but anyway. But did you do that? Did you sort of prepare yourself before you knock on a door? If you had the data? Like if somebody had spoken at a city council meeting, you'd have that.
Yeah. So what I would do, and you can see it if you want, I do have the app on here today, but I had a volunteer, and that was extremely helpful because as I'm talking to the citizen, he's taking the notes. He's a few feet behind me, not in the way. Most of the time they're not looking at him, they're, we're engaged in a conversation. So he took all the notes. When we wrap up, we'd walk down the driveway, he would just, I've already got it sorted by street and street number. He would just bring up the next street number and say, okay, we've got Bob and Mary next. I'd have a checkbox, and if the checkbox was marked, it basically meant go to notes. And so if you saw the checkbox marked, you'd go down to notes, and it could be, like I said, anything that they spoke in favor of this issue. Maybe they were a member of the Soil and Water Commission, a county commissioner, that type of stuff. Just enough of a unique identifier that I had something unique to talk to that voter about.
So then just one quick follow-up, sorry.
Yep, no.
Did you then, so after you've done your canvassing and you've met people and knocked on doors and been at the state fair and all of that, and you got all this data, how did you use that proactively? I mean, I understand the mobility and the tool-based stuff, but then, you can only scale yourself so far. Were you able to, did you follow up with people by email? Did you do it? Did you encourage them to follow you on Twitter or come to a blog or what?
The demographics of my neighborhood, if I saw someone I could tell they were technically savvy, I'd mention the website and the Facebook and that, but for the most part, if I'd said Twitter to a lot of people, they'd have had no idea. And I don't want to go in making any of those kinds of assumptions because in a political campaign, then you look a little hoity-toity. No, most of the proactive stuff was preparing me for that door knocking. Yes, there were other times though. So for example, if I was knocking on doors, people would go, and everyone knew when the election was, but there's also a primary. And before the primary, people would say, well, when's the primary? And they'd go, and whether it was the primary or the general election, I would get some people go, I'm going to be out of town then. Is it okay if I go pick up a vote by absentee ballot and get it dropped in the mail for you? So I'd make those notes so that I would be the one to help them get an alternate to be able to vote, even though they were going to be in Sarasota or wherever it was. So there'd be things like that. Otherwise, had I been elected, I'd have had a list of people whose issues were concerned. I'd bring that into something. Should I run for office again, which is likely, I've got that data as well. If they're still in my same district, I can go back to them and say, hey, we talked 2 years ago when I stopped by, or we talked 2 years ago at Oakdale Summerfest or City Council meeting. And I still do, I will still run into people at City Council meetings and stuff where I do have this database with me, and if someone gets up and speaks, I'll pull it up. And then after they've spoken, after the City Council meeting, I'll go introduce myself and say, hey, you spoke on such and such, that type of stuff. But yeah, that's how I use it going forward right now.
So you scored 7.5%.
Absolutely.
How did that compare on average to the other IP candidates?
Independence Party candidates in 2010 ranged anywhere from 2 and 3% up to, we actually had one U.S. House race where I think we had 20%. Gubernatorial candidate did 12%. Yeah, that's where we hit that.
So when you're not comparing apples to apples here. When you look at the IP candidates that were going for either Minnesota Senate or House, what was your average against
similar races? against similar races?
Yeah.
Actually, it was pretty tight. It was 4 to 7%, I think, for our state house, state senate races. Actually, I think we had one person who was at 9%. I actually have that on a spreadsheet on my device if you want to look at it.
I'm just trying to find a metric to compare all of these efforts and how it resulted.
And, you know, and the thing is one of the things I hope I didn't do during this presentation is, because obviously I can't, is take all of the tools I used and say, and this is how you win. Because I can't tell you that yet. But what I can tell you is, in terms of how they were used and what they were used for, they were effective. The challenge is, of course, is that, and I'll say this at a technology conference in front of everyone here, technology alone is not going to win anyone an election. You've got to use technology just like any other business tool, and you've got to address it to a specific need. And I'll give you a perfect counterpoint or example of that from the flip side. The DFL incumbent who I ran against, who is a really good friend, and by the way, he now has an Android phone because he and I have met on the campaign trail. And we struck up a good friendship. But my DFL opponent had no website. I mean, I should go backwards, but I mean, start with no website and then nothing technical than that. No mobile site, no Twitter account, no Facebook page, none of that. And yet he still beat two opponents and scored 53% of the vote to win. So, you know, I won't be so disillusioned as to say it was the technology's fault, or if I'd had more technology, I would have won. But it was an important tool, and it gave me some advantages in my, you know, even more challenging race than someone in a major party would have had.
The governor's race in Tom Corner used technology very well. Can you talk about some of the lessons that they learned? You know, because it seems that they were really good at breaking out of expectations of the small margin people expect them to get, and they got much more. And the IP, their website, everything, it seems that they're doing a lot with the technology to really give a lot of credibility to their party and to reach a lot of younger voters and things like that.
I can't speak specifically to Tom's campaign. Part of the reason was, and I actually knew Tom long before he ran, before he was even an independent. I know when he was a Republican. But what I can tell you, I think to the point you're trying to go to, Heidi, is, you know, as an independence party or any third party, you know, we have a lot of challenges, whether it's money, volunteers, resources, that we just don't have that other parties do. One of the ways you try to overcome that is there is a ton of free, easily accessible, at worst, inexpensive technology out there that we can use for outreach to speak farther than, you know, 100 volunteers knocking on doors can do. And technology has been an important part in messaging for our party, and as it is for the Greens and the Progressives and all the other third-party candidates. And there sort of seems to be a little bit of a gap with the major parties down at the lower level, because obviously they don't need it to win. And you start to wonder what would happen if they leveraged it. But, you know, there are some programs that the national parties will do on a national level. But go ahead, Colin.
But doesn't every political party on some level use some kind of centralized database to try to cull and, you know, gather all this information together about the constituents?
Oh, absolutely.
I think there was Vote Builder on the DFL side. You had, I think Trailblazer probably did something. I don't know how much. And I think even the Greens have Drupal CDCRL set up.
Well, and the other thing too, in that, yeah, every party lives on a database. It's like the heart and soul of party building and getting the message out. But also, a lot of people ask me about the Obama campaign. The fact of the matter is, I can remember, because I've been in wireless long enough, I don't remember if it was Julio or another presentation earlier today, someone brought up the Palm 7 from I think it was 1996, 1997. There were actually presidential, so what would it be, the 98 presidential campaign? Was 98 a presidential year? They had volunteers with Palm 7s knocking on doors, doing the same thing I did. But what I did for free 13 years later was costing them millions of dollars at the time. So as someone who follows technology trends, that is, you know, you can look at what's being done today in the Obama campaign, and I'll guarantee you within 10 years, anyone here could run for office and use those same tools because someone over there just figured out a way to do it cheaper and easier, and maybe it's ad supported. Yeah. So. All right, well, if there's no other questions, thank you for attending. If you want to see the apps I use,